Welcome to today's Religion Media Centre Zoom briefing, where we'll be discussing what we could call the Martin Bashir affair, or we could call the BBC affair, or we could call the government's deeply upset with and threatening to reform the BBC discussion. With us is Bishop Nick Baines, the Bishop of Leeds and former chair of the Sanford St Martin Awards. Right. Bishop, can I ask you, first of all, when you heard about the report when it came out, what was your reaction?
I wasn't surprised by anything that I read as it was reported. I hadn't read the report at that point. It raised a number of questions for me, but one of the questions was actually whether too much is being put onto the head of Martin Bashir in this. That was one question. Correlation isn't an explanation necessarily. And the second question I had really was, is this going to be an opportunity now for the BBC haters to give it a thrashing? And being honest with you, they were the two questions that immediately came to mind.
Well, I think we know the answer to the second one, but let's deal with the first about Martin Bashir. Mm-hmm. Of course, Lord Dyson made very clear that he preferred the account of Earl Spencer to that of Martin Bashir in terms of the meeting that took place before the Earl introduced Martin Bashir to his sister. Mm-hmm. However, not everybody thinks that the Earl Spencer's account should be taken at 100% face value. There are arguments, but it is the case that Martin Bashir has accepted that he lied, apologized for the fact that he lied, although he still hasn't given a coherent account of why he had mocked up those bank statements. And it is clear that, as I say, Lord Dyson prefers the account of Earl Spencer. So we appear to be in a situation where Martin Bashir has apologized for some things, but in the view of Lord Dyson, has not told the whole truth. Mm. In these circumstances, what would you say to Martin Bashir?
I think it's well known, isn't it, that if people get into big trouble, it's usually because of the cover-up rather than the event or the crime. And it would be in Martin Bashir's interests to come completely clean and give a full account of what he did and why he did it. That's going to be extraordinarily painful for him and probably for others, but it lances the boil. Otherwise, the questions are going to persist as to not only what he did, but why he did it. And if you don't provide a coherent account, as you've suggested, Roger, then you create a vacuum into which other people will insert their interpretations, and that may not be in the interests of anyone, not least Martin.
And in Christian terms, forgiveness and repentance, or rather forgiveness, depends upon a complete repentance. I mean, you can't sort of partially repent and be forgiven. You have to tell the whole truth as you understand it to be.
I mean, forgiveness assumes that, as I was saying in a church yesterday at confirmation, the first thing we do in most Anglican services is ask, right, who screwed up? And we all put our hands up and go, well, me, actually. That's the leveling, the starting point. So the starting point of being a Christian, for me, my understanding, is this acknowledgement that we're all swimming in this pool. How you deal with it then is what's important. But unless we are open about the fault, it's hard to see how we can be open to the forgiveness that enables us to start again.
Could we then look at the reaction of of Prince William, which really put rocket boosters under this. And the direct line that Earl Spencer and Prince William takes to the death of Diana, which a lot of people are troubled by. What we know is that the princess had given hundreds of hours of tapes to Andrew Morton 3 years before this interview, and that had encouraged her friends to talk about the breakdown of her marriage and what she felt. We also know that that her security detail was removed at her request 2 years before the interview took place. We also know that the princess had talked to Sir Max Hastings when he was editor of the Daily Telegraph, wanting him to run these stories. We know that she wanted to give an interview. So the idea that she would not have given the interview were it not for Martin Bashir's misleading her is not the case. Are you worried then about this line that is being drawn by Earl Spencer's and others, which is to hold Martin Bashir, as it were, directly, or if not directly, very closely to the death of the princess?
Well, I said earlier that correlations aren't necessarily explanations. And I think, although Martin Bashir has admitted, and I think he did, a number of years ago, the conversation he had with Anne Sloman and Tony Hall, which is recorded in the report, he admitted that he'd fabricated this stuff, a very long time ago. But the fact that he has done this wrong thing doesn't necessarily mean that he's responsible for what then ensued 2 years later. And as you've recorded then, it was quite evident that, had he not done that, all of this stuff would have come out in the story of the relationship and the damage that was done to the Prince of Wales and Princess Diana and their relationship. That was well documented and well on the way. What role the Bashir interview played, I think, is questionable. And I don't mean questionable that it's of no account. I just mean there's a question about what actual role it played in the destruction that followed.
In the light of that, do you think it was wise of Prince William to make the statement he did? I think people would understand why, having gone through what he has done, he would wish to defend the reputation of his mother. But to make statements which make a strong connection, suggesting that she would not have died had it not been for such media behavior, and particularly the interview that Martin Bashir conducted, do you think that was going too far, and that the prince would have been better not to say such things?
I think it's easy for any of us on the outside to suggest that he might have handled it differently, but he lost his mother in these circumstances. He's got this rift with his brother, who clearly has been more powerfully impacted mentally and in terms of his mental health by what happened in those days. I think it's understandable that he would make a fairly devastating statement. Whether it'll stand the test of scrutiny and time, I think is for others to discuss. It's very early days, but his coming out and responding in that devastatingly quiet way, I think it was described as being, a furious response. It seemed to me very, very measured. But I think we'll have to wait and see whether it stands up to scrutiny. I just don't know.
But then the problem is that we have to not treat it as gospel truth, do we? We have to say that if the royal family steps into areas of controversy, then their remarks have to be, however understandable, have to be examined with the same, if you like, clarity that we would examine anybody else's. That's the problem, if you like, for the royal family. Once they stop into areas of controversy, even if it's of the most personal and family nature, is that we cannot regard their statements as being true. We can believe them as being well-intentioned, but we have to examine them as we would examine any other.
Well, I think that's self-evident, really. You can only arrive at the truth by questioning and scrutiny. What I'm saying is I understand the emotion and the psychological impetus behind both the sons need to say something, because otherwise what happens to them, from a media perspective, they'll be inundated with, well, what's your response? What are you going to say? They've got to say something. And how do you say something that isn't bland? But you're right. I mean, any statement anyone makes, if I make a statement, I expect it to be open to scrutiny. And, if I'm wrong, I should apologize and set it right. But I don't think the princes could deal with everything that is being piled into one statement at that point in time.
Can we turn to the BBC? Well, we could call it a cover-up. We could call it a totally inadequate investigation, which was roughly what Lord Dyson says. It clearly was woefully inadequate. I think we can accept his word on that. The reasons why it was so inadequate are debatable, but I wonder whether, from your perspective, the Church of England, which has had its difficulties, as the Roman Catholic Church has, as other institutions, with issues such as child abuse, understands the BBC management position, which seems to me to be a desire, who knows what their personal ambitions are, but a desire to protect the institution first, which is a criticism that has been leveled in the past against, for example, your church, related to child abuse, that the instinct is quieten things down, shut things up, protect the institution, be concerned about its reputation, which is entirely understandable, but ultimately, presumably, you now think, or would say, wrong if it places the institution before the individual and before the truth.
Well, it's completely understandable. The question, though, is it intentional? There may be a reflex or an instinct to defend an institution of which you're part. If you question me about safeguarding, for example, in the Diocese of Leeds, I would say we have a complete interest in transparency and openness, because if we mess it up, we're not messing it up for the institution, we're messing it up for the people who need to be protected or defended. So when I read the account in the Dyson report, which I did very quickly, admittedly, I thought, well, I actually found it impossible to decide whether there was intention in protecting the institution or whether it was incompetence. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis put on the fact that Tony Hall and Anne Sloman simply accepted, and Tim Gardam as well, simply accepted Martin Bashir's account of things without going and asking Earl Spencer, for example, what his response was. Now, it might be, and I've tried to imagine myself into this position, if the charge is Martin Bashir forged some, mocked up some documents and used them, and they were the deciding factor in a decision for the Earl to open the door to Diana, then in one sense they addressed it when they questioned him. They found that he admitted it, he apologized for it. He didn't see there was a causal link between her agreeing to the interview and his production of those dodgy documents.
If that is all, of course, Earl Spencer says there was a lot more that was disguised. And of course, there you have a situation where, well, I don't want to get too much, but Martin Bashir admits some lies to Tony Hall and Anne Sloman, but still Tony Hall reports to the board of management and the government that Martin Bashir is totally trustworthy and honourable and so on. But passing that away, and there's another option, isn't there? There is a decision not to look further because you're afeared of what you're going to find. In other words, you're not actually concealing information you have. You are deliberately not trying to find out anymore. There's that option, and we don't know what that is. But there is a disturbing other consequence, which is that the graphics artist, for example, who, as far as I can see, and anybody in the business would probably agree with me, was a totally innocent party in this. Tony Hall then says, we'll make sure he's never employed again.
Yeah.
So the man who lies continues, and the man who simply carries out putting graphics together is punished. And indeed, there are some who believe, but again, it's contentious, that they were subsequently had to leave Panorama because of this. That's, I think, what sticks in the craw. But can I move on to perhaps what is most another strange matter is the reemployment. Martin, on his own account reasons, went to ITV, went to America. And then people were rather astonished some people were astonished when he was appointed back onto the BBC as the religion correspondent, not at that stage editor. When you met him and dealing with him, did you think he was a good and appropriate person to do that job?
Well, I think several things. I was surprised when he was appointed. I'd never met him before, but I was surprised. But my main surprise was what happened in America. Being completely frank with you, it wasn't the Diana stuff, because I didn't know much about, I hadn't dug into any of that. It was the, his resignation in America that made you question whether it was appropriate. But I would have to say that in all my dealings with him as a bishop, I never had a reason to complain about him. He was always very civil. He was very open. He was quite probing on things he quizzed me on. But I didn't find anything inappropriate in the way he went about being the religion correspondent or religion editor. That was my experience.
Well, he was subsequently, and partly as a result of the BBC review into its religious coverage, he was then moved up to being religion editor. And various other promises were made. What is important now, in terms specifically of the BBC's religious coverage?
Sorry, Roger, can you just say what you mean other promises were made? I didn't quite understand.
You and I will remember that the BBC was going to increase the numbers of reporters and investment and good coordination between various.
I thought you meant promises to him.
No, sorry. Promises about an improved coverage. Well, Martin Bashir has been not effectively carrying that out the job for some time. The BBC has not advertised, or so far anyway, as far as I know, for a replacement. This is a moment, perhaps, for the BBC to consider its coverage of religion. What do you think should now happen? Do you think, for example, the job of religion editor in news, and remember it's only news, not elsewhere, should be immediately advertised?
Well, I do. You're probably going to say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? But we argued over many years for an appointment like this on the grounds, and not as some people assume, that churchy people or religious people want to do special pleading, but on the grounds that you cannot understand the world. You can't understand politics. You can't understand what's going on in the world if you don't understand religion. And that's, what you happen to believe about it is irrelevant. But if you don't understand religion, both as a prime motivator for individual and for corporate community decision-making, prioritizing behavior, and so on, then you can't, if you don't understand religion, you can't understand how the world works or why it works the way it does. So if we need a finance editor or a business editor, because these things are complicated, we need, and as a former professional linguist, I would describe it as this way. You actually need someone who can interpret for the sake of the news, and interpret the news as seen through an appropriately religious lens, but also interpret religion through a news lens. So I think it is a very important role that needs to be replaced very quickly.
And that, of course, is a role specifically within news. But as you know, there is nobody within the BBC, certainly nobody on the board of management, who is, if you like, the religious authority, if you like, the centre of authority in this area within the BBC. So, for example, I suspect that when the then director of news appointed Martin Bashir, he had no one to talk to no one outside news of barony about whether who was appropriate and so on. Are you happy that the BBC is sufficiently authoritative across the board in its religious programming and understanding?
Well, the short answer is the obvious answer, no. But in some areas, it's better than it used to be. And I think the Religion Review actually came with some very positive things. It was taken very seriously. And I think there was progress made. But I think the BBC always faces a dilemma. And forgive me for getting the jargon, the language wrong here, but do you take, across the organisation approach? So you look at religion across everything: news, drama, documentary, sport, so on and so forth. Or do you have what might be called a silo? Now, both come with pros and cons, but I think the Religion Review attempted to take a look across the whole organisation and say, how do we best organise this? The other problem with it, of course, is that you've got to have people who have suitable qualification or experience to be able to do this work, and a vague interest in something. I mean, you wouldn't. I used to think Evan Davis was just fantastic as the business editor or economics editor, given that I'm not an economist, because he helped me to understand stuff. But I doubt if he'd got the job if he just picked on economics as an interesting thing and thought he'd get a job out of it. You've got to have some experience, expertise, and nous. So the same goes for religion. You can't just pluck someone out and say, well, they went to a mosque once, so that'll be useful. And how that's implemented across an institution like the BBC is complex, I think.
Well, we know from the Secretary of State that the midterm review of the BBC Charter is going to be tough and searching or whatever. You would obviously think that religion, the coverage of religion and ethics should not be should be central to that. But it's
Roger, I would want to say we have the least religiously literate government I think I can remember, and that's being shown in many different ways. So some people are going to have to work very hard when it comes to charter renewal to argue the case in relation to religion and ethics. It's too. I mean, I keep arguing, in the House of Lords over various things like the Internal Market Bill, the Withdrawal Agreement originally, the Overseas Operations Bill, that we have to listen to ethical arguments, not just reputational or pragmatic or legal arguments. We have to take ethics seriously. But again, ethics aren't obvious. So when it comes to charter renewal, if we're going to argue the case with government, we're going to have to make a very strong case for the importance of ethics with a government that where ethical questions range widely at the moment, let's put it that way.
Are you worried about this midterm review? It's obviously essential that such a review takes place. This is a publicly funded body. People have to pay their license, so they have no real choice. So in principle, a review is a good thing, but are you worried about it?
Well, I'm always worried about it because you never know which way a review is going to be. But I think energy, my energy and others have to be going into trying to provide a substantial rationale behind the need for ethics and religion to be taken seriously by government and by the institution of the BBC and the wider media.
Can I pick up there a question here from Stephen Pattinson? and it relates to the coverage over the recent years in the BBC, and he says, does the Bishop have any thoughts about why so few religion stories are reported on the BBC? Does this have anything to do specifically with Martin's gifts and talents, or is there something else at play? I can only remember hearing Martin Bashir a handful of times during his tenure of the role, though that, of course, is anecdotal and maybe down to my fallible memory. Stephen, I'm not sure it is. I mean, we used to say in the business about news that it was only interested in religion if a bishop was wearing a funny mitre and there were great pictures of cathedrals. I'm sure we were being a little too cynical, but do you think a lot is unreported? Either because it's not recorded, thought it's important, or because a religious or ethical perspective is often not considered?
I think there's a difference between reporting about religion and religious phenomena or religious communities and reporting the world through a religious lens. And the latter is much more complicated. It's much more complex. The former is easier, but I think we all recognise, those of us who've been involved both in religion and the media, that dog bites man is not a story. Even at parish level, wondering why the local newspapers aren't interested in, and it's a different story, but aren't interested in the parish having a picnic and a raffle. It's because it just isn't interesting. And I still think religious bodies like the church have a responsibility for ensuring that they tell their stories in a way that matches the media demand. It's the medium that matters there. So as a friend of mine in the media once said, in commercial media, there is no problem with religion on commercial media, provided the stories you tell are worth hearing and they fit the medium that you're pitching them to. I think there's a responsibility on both sides, on the media to report and to represent religion, usually positively, not always negatively, as part of the solution rather than the problem, but also on the part of religious bodies to take their narrative seriously and work out, to do the hard work of how you tell it. But I do think there have been some very good stories told in the media. I mean, some, very recently, and it's probably got nothing to do with Martin Bashir, but over food banks during lockdowns, and the roles of churches and other religious groups, there's been a lot of storytelling, but it's not banging the drum. It's just telling the story and let the reader, let the viewer see what's going on. There have been some very, very good stories.
Can I, towards the end of our discussion, draw us to a problem I think that both the church has and the BBC has, which is its relationship with royalty. There is part of society and so on that expects the BBC to, as it were, to be a unifying country, a unifying element in the country, to celebrate the monarchy and obviously to ensure that it covers the monarchy in a positive way. There's another part of it which says the journalistic function is to scrutinize power and everything, and you report about it. Particularly, you can't have the BBC not report things about the royal family that are on the front pages of other newspapers. The same way you as a church, on the one hand, are expected to stand by and with the royal family at state occasions and so on. And at the same time, you're committed to follow a man who was not particularly interested in power, was interested in the poor and the oppressed and those parts of society. And yet the church frequently has found itself in the past on the side of authority, reinforcing power, and not on the side of, if you like, those without power. So are you finding yourself in that same situation as the BBC does, that you have two and sometimes almost contradictory requirements upon you when it comes to dealing with royalty?
Well, I'm tempted to say, that's life. We never resolve these things. there are always these tensions. I remember having a debate with a journalist once, some years ago, who just wanted, thought organized religion was a complete turn off, kill it off, and leave it up to little groups, of like-minded people locally. And I remember thinking at the time, so where are you? I mean, I think of it as the Humanists Association as well, National Secular Society. Where are your food banks? Where are you organizing to support the poor? Where do you have the infrastructure to do the things that the man from Galilee talked about, even though we mess it up a million times? And the Church of England has to walk that fine line, I think, of knowing that we probably get it all wrong all the time, but we still have, it's still a tension with which we have to live. And in relation to royalty, I think all I can say is my own experience with royalty is limited, but it was very frank and very honest.
Andrew Brown has sent us a question here, and he says, do you think that the only journalist in the whole story to have behaved irreproachably was Max Hastings, who refused the offered interview, that is by Princess Diana, on the grounds that it could only damage everyone? That's an editor of a newspaper taking a decision himself not to publish, but as it were, in the greater interest. Was Max Hastings right to say, no, I'm not going to carry your interview, Princess Diana, in the Daily Telegraph?
Well, I think that's a fantastic question that, it's an editor's job to decide what you're going to carry and what you're not going to carry. And there are many things carried in newspapers and in the media that, are always going to be damaging, sometimes to everyone, and you wonder why they bother. I think there's a deeper question, which is, does everything have to be out on the front page? Does everything have to be out in the in the light of day? And I think that's a really vexed question. Was he right or not? I really don't know, Roger. I think.
Well, I suppose
I think what it does demonstrate is, from Max Hastings, is a sense of responsibility that the reporting the news is not neutral.
But if you don't report that, and if, for example, you show photographs of, had shown photographs of Prince Charles and Diana together smiling, you would be perpetrating a lie.
Yes, but I would
ask. You can lie by omission.
Yes, but was Max Hastings' newspaper not reporting anything on the tension between the royal couple? Or was it reporting stuff and showing images? I can't answer that question. In which case, it wasn't being neutral. I mean, there's no such thing as neutrality anyway. But that's different from saying, we're going to carry this because the princess with her agenda wants us to carry it as part of a different, battle that she's having with the royal family. For example, that's a different question.
Now, another person has dialed in to point out that we've been talking perhaps always in national terms, really, about coverage and in terms of the BBC's religious coverage. And that person wanted to make the point that local radio, covers, which reaches perhaps 700,000 people a week, does cover a great deal of stories.
I actually made a note while I was responding to your question about whether the BBC does enough. I wrote down local, but I didn't get to it, so I apologise, Alex, but I did mean to. And she's dead right, and it's the local stories that have big impact. And if I think in the past I've been quite concerned about the diminution of local broadcasting, because that's where you can really deal with nuance as well, and the local take on a particular story.
Now, coming to the end of our discussion, the Martin Bashir affair, if we can say it, has calmed down for a moment. Other stories are coming forward, though who knows what will come out in the future. But is it your view that actually, although this has been very serious, it did happen 25, actually slightly more than 25 years ago, there have been various changes in the structure of BBC management. We've gone from governors to a trust to a unified board. We have a situation now where the BBC is responsible to Ofcom. Is it your sense now that we need a period of reflection? We don't need, and the BBC ought to be allowed to get on with resolving these issues itself? Or do you feel that the situation is so serious that outside bodies ought to be more directly involved?
Well, the BBC is a public institution paid for by taxpayers, so it has to be accountable and open to scrutiny. But I think that scrutiny should be done as unemotively as possible, all round. So BBC bashing is something that I deplore in general, on the grounds that I've traveled the world, I've worked in other places. I was a Soviet specialist when I was younger, so I read Pravda and Izvestia every day. It's no wonder I've turned out the way I haven't done that. We've got to be careful that we don't lose something that is unique and precious. But you could argue that if it's that precious, the scrutiny needs to be even sharper. But is it scrutiny intended to diminish, or scrutiny intended to build up? I think that's an important question for those involved.
Finally, of course, there are some who would say BBC's time is over. The Secretary of State himself made reference yesterday to Netflix and other things that are coming along and dominating the viewing. Of course, though it should be said that they tend to choose international subject matter, thrillers, murders, and so on. There's rather more to broadcasting than that. But there are some people that take the view that the time of the BBC is over, that now so much is provided elsewhere, the markup on the whole works, we don't have market failure. Do you think we still do have, if you like, market failure when it comes to covering religion? That if we did not have a national broadcaster committed to public service in this way, coverage would diminish?
Well, show me in most commercial media where either religion or ethics are taken seriously. Now, we do ethics through film and through theatre and through music and all sorts of other things, but to take it seriously, it's always going to be difficult to I think it's always going to be difficult to account for complex and serious issues in media that rely primarily on entertainment. Now, that doesn't mean that the BBC doesn't need to look at how it does religion and ethics and whether there are more creative ways of doing it. I remember for a long time, I keep being asked to go on The Big Questions, and I've done it a few times, and then I just thought, this is just a bear pit. It's enlightening nothing, really. So I just started saying no. I think there are better ways of doing some of these things, but going back to the, Malcolm Muggeridge days, it's not on. But there must be more creative ways. And the BBC, if the BBC doesn't do it, it ain't going to get done. And I think we'd be impoverished as a culture.
Well, Bishop Nick Baines, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. I know you've been in meetings all morning since very early. You're going to go on to all night. I hope you get a chance at least for a quick cup of coffee. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us.